You're listening to the Monocle Daily, first broadcast on the 17th of July 2025 on Monocle Radio.
The UK continues winning back friends in Europe, more plugs pulled out of American public broadcasting, and what do you most fear shortages of? I'm Andrew Muller. The Monocle Daily starts now. Hello and welcome to the Monocle Daily, coming to you from our studios here at Midori House in London. I'm Andrew Muller. My guests Nina Dos Santos and Charles Hecker will discuss the day's big stories, and our weekly letter from is a letter from one of Europe's more under-considered front lines. Stay tuned, all that and more coming up right here on the Monocle Daily. This is the Monocle Daily. I'm Andrew Muller, and I am joined today by Nina Dos Santos, international broadcast correspondent and former CNN Europe editor, and Charles Hecker, political risk analyst, Russia expert, and author of Zero Sum, The Arc of International Business in Russia. Hello to you both.
Good afternoon. Good evening.
Nina, first of all, dedicated listeners to the Monocle Daily, like we have any other kind, etc., will know that earlier this week we did discuss the disfavour into which the private swimming pool is falling in some sectors of France. And you, I put it to you, have recently been lounging in front of just such a controversial installation.
Well, it's a hard job, but somebody has to do it, right? Getting in front of the story in your bikini, in Mougins in the south of France, courtesy of a friend of mine who's decamped to there and has her own pool, which, by the way, was built before lots of municipalities in France have started curtailing planning applications to build your own pools, because in France they appear to have soared since 2019, basically because of the pandemic, it seems, and also climate change. A lot more French people want their own private pool in their backyards, but that is depleting the water table around France, notably in parts of Provence, where I was, but also all the way up to Brittany as well, which is one of the rainier parts of France too.
Has this become scorchingly controversial in Paris? Could we yet see France branching out its splendid tradition of municipal civil disobedience into its first swimming pool riots?
Well, they'd have to swim down the Seine for that, and they can't very often, can they? Because the water quality isn't great. I think that, it is continues to be a sort of, a tale of the haves and have-yots, doesn't it? It's viewed like that in France. It's not a huge topic, but obviously the environmental lobby is hot on the case. And also, there's a sense that France, in a time like this, where, remember, this is a country that still has a wealth tax, yes, there's a bit of nanny statism going on, but there's also an idea that, French people should be a bit more responsible. Agriculture is important in France. Conserving the environment and protecting it is important. And as a result, there's a big question mark over whether people need so many private swimming pools. I will say this was not my swimming pool. So,
That's not going to be an excuse.
Dove in the deep end of the story, nonetheless.
It's not going to be an excuse when the revolution comes, Nina. Charles, you are going to a particularly parched stretch of Europe. Will you be nobly abjuring the swimming pool while you are there?
Well, I will be sort of abusing the environment in a different sort of way, and that is I am traveling from air-conditioned venue to another air-conditioned venue in an air-conditioned car in search of sort of little spots of cold air. I'm going to be starting in the very south of Spain and then driving all the way to the north of Spain with a friend, wandering our way through Portugal for a while, and I'm told that the temperature sort of hovers somewhere between 35 and 38 degrees Celsius, judging by how I felt during sort of a slightly lesser heat wave in the United Kingdom. I'm bracing myself for a fairly toasty trip. There is one swimming pool along the way, but mostly it's going to be about a search for air conditioning.
Well, we look forward to hearing about it upon your return, but we will begin here in the UK, where Prime Minister Sir Keir Starmer has been hosting German Chancellor Friedrich Merz. It is not an exclusively social visit. The pair have signed a wide-ranging treaty, being ballyhooed as the first such arrangement between the two countries since the unpleasantness which concluded 80 years ago. The headline is a mutual defence pact, though this maybe isn't that big a deal given that both are committed to each other via the NATO treaty anyway. But there are also measures attached to German investment in the UK and tackling irregular migration. Charles, is this that big a deal?
Well, Andrew, I was just thinking about all this. It's almost as if there were once a time when France and Germany and the United Kingdom were in a political and economic union that allowed this sorts of cooperation fairly easily. Yeah, I mean, so is this Europe sort of saving itself, and is this Europe finally getting its military and defense-oriented stuff together? Possibly. Things are going well. There was a sort of mini love fest, although not on all points, between the UK and France not too long ago. There is a mini love fest going on between the United States and Germany. What's interesting is that they are able to agree more easily on issues of defense and international matters, foreign affairs, driven together perhaps by sort of the specter of, Donald Trump sort of throwing all of Europe under the bus. They are coming up short a little bit on domestic and sort of small cross-border issues. The United Kingdom and France came to an agreement on immigration with a sort of one in, one out agreement. The UK and Germany are close on immigration, but I don't think that they've signed a final agreement about what happens when Germany ships migrants to France and then those migrants wind up in the UK.
Nina, as Charles suggested, this does follow a broadly similar photo opportunity and treaty signing thing between Sir Keir Starmer and French President Emmanuel Macron. And I was struck that just as Macron did, so did Chancellor Merz talk today, quite frankly, of his regrets of the fact of Brexit. Were you surprised that both Merz and Macron had been, well, some might have thought it almost tactless?
I'm not sure, because I think the sentiment that the UK left the EU still, is something that people across Brussels remain sad about, even though they make a big show of saying that they've moved on. Economically, they just can't really understand why the UK would want to be outside of the EU with all of its opportunities. But they're also keeping a keen eye on the fact that the UK, having Brexited, now is able to have its own bare bones trade deals with the United States. Obviously, pipped the EU to the post on that front. And it's also got some sectors that it can leverage for the benefit of Germany and also France, in particular, as Charles was just saying before, the defence sector. And Friedrich Merz is quite keen to make sure that the UK is involved in any sort of tripartite attempt to create a kind of defence shield for Europe, that it isn't uniquely a sort of French-led initiative that then Germany has to pay for.
Charles, just to pick up on that theme of the regrets expressed by certain amounts of Europe, still nearly 10 years now since the Brexit referendum, do we imagine a point possibly before the next election at which Starmer will dare start that conversation among the British?
Isn't that the political third rail in British politics? And that is sort of bringing up the accursed question of whether we should go back, even though public opinion increasingly seems to be in favor of that kind of decision. Here's where things get a little bit tricky, though, I think. And while there seems to be a certain amount of regret, lingering regret, and sorrow among our former European compatriots, although I should point out, of course, we are still a part of Europe, at least geographically, if nothing else, they may make EU re-entry quite painful. And that may be something that any prime minister and Keir Starmer in particular may not want to engage with, because, of course, nobody wants to set the precedent of a country exiting the union, sort of finding that it's not all that great on the outside of the tent and then being welcomed back in. There are all kinds of punitive measures that the European Union could take to make re-entry painful, to teach us a lesson. And remember, Nina's absolutely right that there is regret about the UK's absence, but there's also still some anger that lingers.
Nina, to bring it back to what the headline was today, this defence cooperation agreement between the UK and Germany, and the implicit suggestion, I think there's a signal being sent here to the United States that, look, we're doing as you asked, we are taking responsibility for our own continent, etc., etc., etc. But is that line holding, especially as we discover this week that after everybody breathes a sigh of relief last week that there's going to be some mechanism to get American weapons to Ukraine, even if it means, Europe buying them from America and then effectively donating them to Ukraine. France and Italy have now decided they don't want any part of this.
Yes, and that's not surprising, actually. From Italy's point of view, obviously, it's not one of the big spenders inside NATO, and to get to that 5% target, it would have to throw an awful lot of stuff into the package. And Italy also has a lot of US air bases, so it feels that it also offers up quite a lot militarily to the United States in terms of, its footprint here militarily in this part of the world. And France wants, and this has been clear for many a year, that they want Europeans to buy European weaponry that is largely made by France. So, it's not surprising that Emmanuel Macron would have initially balked at this particular idea when there was this suggestion sort of cooked up by Mark Rutte, the Secretary General of NATO, to say, well, OK, as long as you, President Trump, as long as you agree to support Ukraine, we'll buy it all. And we can allow NATO to disperse all of this. Obviously, Emmanuel Macron is like, well, why are you buying American weaponry? You should be buying European.
Well, to the United States, the Senate of which has approved a plan which would, among other effects, cancel $1.1 billion allocated to the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, better known as its broadcast arms, NPR and PBS. Also for the chop, pending final approval by the House of Representatives, is around $8 billion, which would have been spent on foreign assistance programs. The funding of public broadcasters and foreign aid have both long been bêtes noires of the Trumpist tendency, convinced as they are that public broadcasters are nests of treacherous pinkos and that foreigners are foreign. Nina, $1.1 billion in and of itself is a lot of money. Within the context of the federal budget of the United States, it is a rounding error. Is this, therefore, anything other than just plain vindictiveness?
It's politics, isn't it, at play? But it's something that we've seen coming for quite some time, haven't we? And it also speaks to the trends of other countries around the world for completely different reasons. Successive governments in the UK have been trying to rein in the budget of the BBC as well, when they don't like its coverage too. But I think the story speaks to the concern that so many of us journalists around the world have, is that there's not enough being done to defend the unofficial role, democratic role that journalism, independent journalism, particularly in the world's most spoken language, which is English, thanks to America, not thanks to the UK. It's not being defended enough, and the people who are filling the void are Azerbaijan is launching its own TV station. Turkish TV in English is funding like mad. And, we've got all these different countries that aren't what we would consider Western democracies, because spending money on media and filling filling the void in English language as well, not just in their own tongues. That's going to be a big problem for us in the future.
Charles, I do want to talk further shortly about what an overseas international soft power self-inflicted maiming this is for the United States, but not for the first time. When we look at what Trump is doing at home, this will bite really hard among some of his own voters, because there are rural communities in particular for whom NPR and PBS are, actual in some circumstances, literal lifelines.
That's exactly right. And so this is shooting yourself in the foot on the global stage, but also causing significant damage to media audiences outside large cities. The withdrawal of federal funding to NPR and PBS to the Corporation for Public Broadcasting is not a death knell to that organization. It is a significant setback, but they do rely on other sources for funding. What happens is that the further down the food chain you get to these rural stations that are sometimes sole broadcasters, not only of news and information, but also sort of emergency broadcasts and weather warnings and things like that, they may go away because they don't have access to the largesse of the larger stations or the stations that are more national in nature. So yes, this is in red states, in the sort of, I hate to use this expression, but here it comes out of my mouth anyway, in the flyover states. That's where things are going to bite the most, and a lot of those are red states.
Nina, this does follow the gutting of the US Agency for Global Media, which was better known to the world as Voice of America, Radio Free Europe, Radio Free Asia, etc. I did look in on VOA's website earlier. Rather dismally, the lead story is datelined March 15th. But as you correctly point out, many of Voice of America's former slots in Nigeria, Indonesia, Ethiopia, and these are just the ones I was able to find in a hurry, have already been taken over by Chinese media.
Absolutely, and all of their teams have been hired. I was hearing a story about how, but by the way, it's the same with also the BBC World Service retrenching as well in parts of Africa. The whole team will be hoovered up by a Turkish broadcaster, for instance. Sovereign wealth funds in the Middle East are launching new channels as well, and all of this is happening in local tongues and also in English as well. So you've got this opportunity from some of these states to sort of completely change the narrative for even English-speaking viewers here in London, because they can get access to this, and also in local tongues in parts of Africa, other parts of the world. And as you were saying before, very often if it's Chinese funded, you can bet that, of course, there's going to be a very, very pro-Beijing narrative.
Charles, it is hard to know how to quantify the damage this will do, because obviously organisations like VOA, Radio Free Europe, have broadcast to countries like Russia, Iran, North Korea, and the impact they had was considerable.
That's right. Well, you know how bad this is going to be when you see that the editor-in-chief of Russia Today, or RT, Margarita Simonyan, is sort of jumping up and down and praising President Trump's decision to withdraw funding from international broadcasting as an awesome decision. So when Russia's cheering you on, you know you've probably done the wrong thing. And you know, Nina's absolutely right. Not only are the sort of Turkish broadcasters and French and German and all other broadcasters, Russia Today and RT, which would be very, very difficult to call a news broadcaster, is expanding its market and is expressing enormous influence across Latin America most recently. And so as the U.S. withdraws from the global broadcast arena, you know, you've got RT cheering them on.
You mentioned earlier, Nina, and quite rightly, that the BBC World Service has been fairly ruggedly cut back on in recent years as well. And to be clear, again, within the context of the budget of a hefty nation state, they spend beans on the World Service. It costs pretty much precisely nothing. And yet, is it clear to you why Western governments, even allegedly centre-left, liberal, international-facing governments like the one we have here in the United Kingdom, are not only so miserly around this stuff, and please forgive the completely leading question, but just downright cowardly? Why not just say to the public, this costs nothing, and it does phenomenal amounts of good, both for the people on the receiving end and for the country which is broadcasting it?
Well, my observation, having worked for British outlets a little bit, but largely for American outlets, is that politicians only care about the domestic audience. You know, nobody really tunes into foreign news, and in the United States, it's minimal, the coverage. And so the point is, convincing an electorate and your audience that it's worth paying for already is starting out from a losing position. I think that's politically where successive governments have been over years gone by, whether it's with regards to the BBC World Service or whether it's regards to events in America. And I agree with you. I think it's an own goal. Because, you know, the BBC World Service had such massive soft power. Mm-hmm. You know, we're now seeing actually an interesting situation where after the press has been completely dismantled, the other element of soft power, Hollywood, is something that Donald Trump is going for as well. And you just wonder what is going to fill the void, because obviously people, as I was saying before, they might be going to these other channels that are owned by foreign nation states. They're probably not even tuning in at all nowadays, and they're just going on Twitter. Or they're going on Instagram, or they're going on Facebook. So the reality is you know, they're being sent into a well of misinformation, or otherwise they've got foreign, non-democratic sponsored states, news feeds, And that's what they're going to have to choose from in the future. I mean, I'm sorry to have painted a dystopian picture, but I think, that's the track we're heading down if we don't stop fast.
Well, staying with the United States, if there are two things the Trumpist tendency dislike even more than public broadcasting and foreigners, they are science and education. Since returning to office in January, President Trump and/or his acolytes have picked several fights with American educational establishments, threatening or freezing their funding, dissuading them from enrolling overseas students, all the while generally traducing them as bastions of deviancy. This has caught the ear of universities elsewhere, not least in Europe, where at least a fifth of the researchers in top American universities have previously studied and who might be persuaded to return even if the football isn't as good. Charles, are you hearing from your fellow Americans anecdotal evidence of this? Do you know of people in academia who are packing their bags and lighting out for Belgium or France or wherever else?
Yeah, anecdotally and more than that. I mean, there have been some very high-level defections of American academics in the first instance to Canada, but also to the UK and also to France. I mean, there's a bit of a schism. It's a little bit hard for, Nina and I were talking about this before coming into the studio. It's a little bit harder for researchers and senior academics to move around because of the amount of money that it takes for them to relocate. Students are a little bit more flexible. And in fact, a UK education, I was going to say a UK education actually relative to an American education, if you're paying full fare in either jurisdiction, a UK education is actually still a bargain for most American students studying at private American universities. And so they tend to be a little bit more mobile. And we've seen stories recently across the papers about double-digit percentage increases in applications to UK universities from US students. And yes, I mean, I know families who are actively considering sending their, graduating high school seniors to universities outside the United States because they think it's a more stable environment.
Nina, how flagrant should the EU or Europe generally dare be about this? The European Commission announced what it called a Europe initiative in May. It's 500 million euros to attract researchers. But would they be at all worried about if we make it too obvious that we're just trying to welcome in everybody in America who might be useful to us, that Trump might pound his desk and impose tariffs on who knows what?
I suppose it depends which sector you're in, doesn't it? Because obviously if you're at MIT doing AI, well, America is the place to be because it's where all the money is for this research. You're going to get a great job thereafter. It's not particularly contentious. But if, say, for instance, you're doing political science or, you have studying the Middle East and you have certain views that are not palatable to the Trump administration, well, you would, be attracted to moving to somewhere like Toronto or also France. And France, actually, out of those EU countries, is the one that started rolling out the red carpet. This is something that they did in the UK after Brexit. The University of Aix-Marseille, which is where France every summer sort of hosts its Davosian economic gathering, they have brought in a lot of researchers and scientists from America and offered them positions. So I think, there is a war for talent. The EU obviously spies an opportunity. I just think it depends which subject you're researching. But it's chilling, though, isn't it? Let's face it. We've talked here about how the media is on the back foot. Now academia is on the back foot. And the sadness is that America, up until recently, used to be the bastion of defending these very types of institutions.
Charles, I know we should be long past the point of expecting any kind of logic or coherence to what Trump and his administration do. But for a man who claims to judge things by the bottom line, why does this not register with him? International students to the United States alone, $44 billion a year.
I think he's looking at a different priority. I mean, in the first place, I think that President Trump is attacking American universities because he feels that American higher education is a factory for the production of Democrats. And so what he really wants to do is sort of shut that down. And, the research into that topic sort of bears him out. And that is that voting Democrat tends to track, it used to track sort of on financial and sort of economic criteria. It now tracks on educational criteria. And the more educated you are, the more likely you are to vote Democrat. And so you're right, in terms of the sort of the economic advantages of attracting a substantial foreign student body, not to mention the fact that each one of those individuals, as they return home, if and when they do that, are largely ambassadors for America when they go back. He seems to be ignoring that. I guess the way he sees that particular criteria is he thinks that foreigners are coming to the United States and essentially stealing American intellectual property, returning primarily, in his view, to China, to then use what they learned here there to China's economic benefit.
Just finally on this one, Nina, I'll ask you the same question I asked Charles at the start. If you had some cushy academic role at some ivy-covered American university right now, would you be thinking, I'm going to ride this out, or would you be thinking, maybe not, I'm off?
Well, you'd hope so, wouldn't you? Again, it depends which subject you're talking about, doesn't it? I think that's where, because the other thing is you can get cancelled. Not just by Trump. You could get cancelled by popular culture, depending on what you said as well in America. I think the situation is just so febrile at the moment. But as Charles was saying before, I think the issue is he's trying to smash the liberal stranglehold he feels that academia in America currently has on the entire political system and has had for generations since the late 1970s, I suppose. And there's one interesting way that US universities are getting around this. It's the fact that they're all opening up campuses in London. So you've got New York University of, I think it's South Carolina has one. There are all these US universities that have opened up like a little footprint here in Europe. And so what they're doing is they're sending their students over here to study over here. And offering courses here to European students so they can get a degree from NYU without actually ever having to go to New York and face these conditions. And perhaps we're going to see more of that.
Well, finally for our panel, I believe we have musical inspiration first.
Don't take these beautiful things that I've got. Please stay. I want you, I need you, oh God. Don't.
Okay. Staying in the United States, though, the pointing and laughing at which appears to have become a motif of this episode, as well as this last decade or so, there are reports of, if not panic buying, then perhaps agitated purchasing of larger than usual quantities of certain Korean beauty products. This is in anticipation of President Donald Trump's tariff regime snapping back to the 25% with which he has been menacing South Korea. The Korean cosmetics trade, or K-beauty as we are importune to call it, is a big deal globally, exporting circa $5.5 billion worth of dubiously necessary unctions annually. Charles, which Korean cosmetics are you hoarding?
Andrew, the more beauty products that I can slap on my face, the better. Really, let it be anti-wrinkle, or let it be sort of cheek plumping, or let it be brow lifting. I'll take it all.
We did want to broaden this conversation, Nina, to the topic of stockpiling or hoarding more generally. And there have, of course, in this country been two possible cues for that within the last decade. There was, of course, the COVID panic. And you don't strike me as the type who would have stabbed one of their neighbours for the last loo roll in Tesco. But there again, people surprised us during that period. And before that, of course, there was the uncertainties around Brexit. Did you hoard anything at all during either of those episodes?
No, I don't think so. Probably because I've got too much of everything as it is.
You'd pre-ordered.
Pre-ordered, exactly. I don't know. I just think we have such a consumerist mentality, don't we? Society is geared up to make us continuously buy. And actually, interestingly enough, when COVID happened, that was the problem. It was that people weren't used to not buying things all the time. I think that was the problem. They'd sort of, I'd find myself ambling into Marks and Spencer's just to pretend I was able to buy something and then come out with no luro. But I think this is the problem here. We get used to sort of being able to charge up on something, and I don't really understand the Korean skincare trend. I have tried there's apparently a trend to make your skin look like glass. You clean it so much that you end up with glass skin.
And that's good?
Supposedly.
Okay.
Never perfected it. A bit old for that. But I think, It's a bit sad that we hoard things.
Are you a hoarder or a prepper of any sort, Charles?
So I once accidentally found myself sort of slipping into kind of near hoarding behavior.
Was this COVID or Brexit related?
This has been sort of COVID and Brexit and sort of recent, sort of aging and what have you. And it occurred to me that when I turned around one day and I realized in my kitchen that I appeared to have been developing a strategic reserve of coffee. and this is the one thing that, if there is an embargo, a tariff, a spike in prices, or a shortage of coffee, this is where I begin to panic. And I suppose that on some level, subconsciously, a while ago, I was sort of, how you go to the supermarket and you always think, oh, I need this, whether you have, 10 boxes of it at home or not. And for me, that's coffee. So whenever I'm in the supermarket, I buy tons and tons of coffee. And it turns out that I have tons and tons of coffee at home already. So I'm ready to go. When the apocalypse comes, I'm going to be wide awake.
Just finally then, to sort of ask a similar question a different way, is there any particular item, Nina, any particular item or brand, a potential shortage or drying up of which would cause you to bolt to the nearest retailer and sweep as much of it off the shelves as you possibly could?
Milk and coffee.
Milk's not going to do
I can't drink coffee without milk, but I mean, yeah. If I could get the milk, I'll get the milk. You get the coffee, right? And then I'll be all right.
We'll meet among the ashes for a brew.
I mean, Charles, anything other than coffee? It doesn't have to be food related. It could be literally anything.
Paper notebooks and notepads. I am also dangerously close to hoarding behavior on notepads and sort of spiral binders and lined pieces of paper. I love it. I like it in large sheets, in small sheets, bound, unbound, hash print and lined and unlined. Yeah, I've got a pile of notebooks at home. Some of them full, some of them empty.
Well, on that slightly alarming insight into Charles Hecker's home life, Charles Hecker and Nina dos Santos, thank you both for joining us. And finally, on today's show, our weekly letter from is a letter from me from Moldova. I'm back now, though, obviously. If it is not the biggest EU flag ever hoisted, it is at the very least one of the biggest EU flags ever hoisted. It hangs from the parapet of Government House in Chisinau almost all the way down to the pavement 6 stories below. Opposite, on the front of the same building, is the handsome national flag of the Republic of Moldova, the blue, yellow and red emblazoned with an eagle embracing the national coat of arms in its wings. It's exactly the same size, a remarkable statement from a country which is not yet a member of the European Union. But pretty much everywhere in Chisinau that Moldova's own flag flies, the EU flag flies alongside. When I dropped by the Foreign Ministry to meet Foreign Minister and Deputy Prime Minister Mihail Popsoy, the EU flag is planted alongside Moldova's in a corner of his office. Not for the first time, I'm struck by the imbalance in attitudes towards the EU by those countries who are inside it and those who wish they were. That EU flag, often mocked or ignored within the EU, has been flown as a rebel standard by pro-democracy mutineers in Georgia and Ukraine. In member states, the EU is often addressed in tones of irritation and contempt by those who believe it stultifyingly beholden to consensus, compromise, regulation and process. In many of the countries striving for entry into the EU, consensus, compromise, regulation and process sound something like heaven, especially measured against their recent turbulent histories and possible futures. None of this is abstract to Moldova. Ukraine's tiny neighbour is protected by neither the EU nor NATO and barely by its own military, which comprises just a few thousand troops and a parking lot's worth of mostly Soviet-built armour. A chunk of Moldova's territory on the east bank of the Dniester River has been the Russian proxy statelet known as Transnistria since a war in the early 1990s and is believed to host around 1,500 Russian troops.
And we begin in Moldova, where the Yes campaign has won a narrow victory in a referendum on joining the European Union. Despite allegations, Russia meddled in the process in an attempt to secure a no vote.
Last October, Moldovans voted yes to a constitutional amendment enshrining the country's ambitions of EU membership by a tiny margin, just over 10,000 votes out of 1.5 million cast, though this was despite a considerable vote-buying operation run by guess who. Moldovan police tracked money paid from a Russian bank to at least 138,000 Moldovan accounts. On the same day, pro-European President Maia Sandu was re-elected by a more convincing margin. However, another possible disruption to Moldova's progress towards the EU looms in September in the form of parliamentary elections, in which Sandu's Party of Action and Solidarity will have to hold the line against opposition parties whose sympathies and sources of funding may lie further east. When you speak to Moldovans, in government or out, about what a win by pro-Russian parties could mean, the nightmare scenario is well understood. A stalling of the EU accession process, a resumption of flights from and business with Russia, bringing Russian spooks and Russian money, a growing sense of Moldova's ultimate unviability, a kicking in of the factor that is potentially a great weakness as well as a great strength, i.e. that more than half of Moldova's people hold dual citizenship, mostly of EU members Romania or Bulgaria. Among them is President Sandu, who voted in Romania's recent presidential election. All of these people could move themselves and their businesses and their expertise elsewhere, and it would be the better educated and better off who would be most likely to do so, potentially leaving Moldova a sort of West Transnistria. The EU has given some impression of recognising the urgency of the situation. It granted Moldova candidate status in 2022, shortly after Russia launched its full-scale assault on Ukraine. Accession negotiations began in December 2023. But even by the most optimistic assessments, Moldova is at least 4 or 5 years away from actually joining. The EU is fond of thinking of itself as a club, but it has become a club of the most annoying sort. Too exclusive by half, full of spoilt, entitled whiners, the bouncers on the door positively revelling in keeping the importuning riffraff the other side of the velvet rope. It is 22 years since the door was last grudgingly edged open sufficiently to admit a new member, in which time, to persevere with the analogy, one former regular has flounced out in a row over whether the straws in the cocktails were sufficiently twirly, only to trip over their own shoelaces and get run over by a bus. And that is all for this edition of the Monocle Daily. Thanks to our panellists today, Nina Dos Santos and Charles Hecker. Today's show was produced by Chris Chermak and researched by Henry King. Our sound engineer was Steph Chungu. I'm Andrew Muller here in London. The Daily is back at the same time tomorrow. Thanks for listening.